The blinding headlights in my rearview mirror were the last thing I saw before my world violently spun out of control. I am Violet, 28 years old, and I never imagined my own sister would leave me to die in a frozen ditch. I was driving my silver sedan through the heavy snow of Milwaukee when I pressed the brake pedal at a sharp curve, but the car accelerated instead of stopping. The vehicle crashed through the guardrail and plummeted into the ravine below, while I screamed in terror until the airbag knocked me unconscious. Through my fading vision, I saw the black SUV pull over, and my sister Daphne stepped out to stare down at my wreckage for several minutes to ensure I was trapped before she finally called for help. She did not even stay at the hospital to check if I survived the surgery, but simply tossed my purse at the reception desk and walked away without signing a single paper. 5 days later, Daphne returned to the front desk wearing a luxurious coat and shouting with a performative display of panic to ask where I was. She slammed her hand on the counter and screamed, "Where is my sister Violet?" The nurse looked at her with cold eyes and delivered a single sentence that made Daphne freeze in absolute terror. What exactly did the nurse say to wipe that arrogant smile off my sister's face forever? Hit the subscribe button and ring the bell so you do not miss the satisfying revenge in the next part. The steady beeping of the heart monitor was the only sound that welcomed me back from the dead after 24 hours in a coma. I tried to open my eyes, but the harsh fluorescent lights above forced them shut again immediately, while a throbbing pain pulsed through my skull. A middle-aged doctor with a kind face noticed I was stirring and stepped closer to check my pupil response with a small flashlight. He informed me with a relieved smile that I had suffered only a mild concussion because the airbag had deployed at the perfect second to cushion the impact. He explained that although my body was covered in severe bruising and I needed rest, there were no internal injuries or life-threatening complications that required surgery. I tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness pushed me back against the pillows while I scanned the sterile room for a familiar face. A young nurse who was adjusting my IV drip looked at me with an expression that combined pity with professional detachment. She hesitated for a moment before telling me that absolutely no one had come to the emergency room with me yesterday, nor had anyone called to check on my status. She explained that the woman who dropped me off had left my purse at the front desk without providing any insurance information or even a contact number for emergencies before disappearing. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach as I realized I had been completely abandoned in my most vulnerable moment by the only family I had left. I asked the nurse if I could borrow her tablet since my own phone was missing from my personal effects, and I needed to contact my workplace. My fingers trembled uncontrollably as I logged into my personal email account to check for any urgent messages regarding my absence. The inbox was flooded with high-priority security notifications from the private bank that managed our family assets. I opened the banking application and gasped when I saw a series of pending transactions that were waiting for administrator approval. There were 3 separate requests to liquidate a significant portion of the family trust fund that my parents had left under my supervision just hours after my accident. A chilling realization washed over me as I stared at the timestamps on those unauthorized transfer requests. My mind flashed back to a tense conversation I had with Daphne just last week in the kitchen of our shared home. She had been unusually insistent that my sedan needed a full brake service before the heavy winter snowstorms hit Milwaukee. I remembered how she demanded to take my vehicle to a specific garage on the outskirts of town instead of our usual certified mechanic because she claimed they were offering a special discount. She had taken my keys with a strange eagerness and returned the car later that evening claiming everything was in perfect working order. The pieces of this horrifying puzzle finally snapped into place with clarity as I looked at the ceiling. The brake failure was not a mechanical coincidence, but a calculated attempt to eliminate the only obstacle between her and the money. Daphne was drowning in gambling debts, and she knew the only way to access the trust fund was to remove me as the trustee permanently. She did not just leave me here to teach me a lesson about control. She left me here hoping I would be incapacitated long enough for her to steal everything we owned. The nausea I felt had nothing to do with my concussion, and everything to do with the betrayal of my own flesh and blood. I knew I could not stay in this hospital bed for another hour because this building was no longer safe for me. I used the nurse's tablet again to find the private contact number for my lawyer, Mr. Finch. I dialed his line and prayed he would answer despite the fact that it was barely dawn. When his gruff voice answered the call, I quickly explained the situation without giving him time to ask unnecessary questions. I told him that my life was in danger and I needed him to come to the hospital immediately to facilitate a discreet discharge before anyone knew I was awake. Mr. Finch sensed the urgency in my voice and promised to be there within 20 minutes to handle the paperwork and get me to a secure location. I handed the tablet back to the nurse and lay back against the pillows to wait for my rescue while formulating a plan. Daphne thought she had broken me by leaving me for dead in that frozen ditch, but she had only awakened a determination that would be her undoing. I would not call the police just yet, because I needed her to believe her plan was working until I had enough evidence to bury her. The sister she knew died in that crash, and the woman who woke up was ready to go to war. 3 days later, I sat safely in the living room of my best friend Stella with my eyes glued to the tablet screen. The comforting scent of chamomile tea and old books that permeated her cozy apartment stood in stark contrast to the cold and sterile hospital room I had escaped just hours before. The high-definition security feed streaming from my family home showed the front hallway empty and silent until the heavy oak door was thrown open with violent force. I watched as Daphne stormed into the foyer with a look of sheer panic that distorted her usually composed features into something unrecognizable and ugly. She was breathing heavily as she slammed the door behind her and leaned against it for a moment as if her legs could no longer support the weight of her deceit. It was clear that the terrifying news she had received from the nurse at the hospital had sent her spiraling into a state of absolute paranoia. She was no longer the grieving sister putting on a performance for the public, but a desperate criminal realizing the walls were closing in on her. She pushed herself off the door and marched straight toward the home office with a singular purpose that confirmed every dark suspicion I had harbored since waking up from my coma. The hidden camera I had installed on the bookshelf between the encyclopedias captured her trembling hands as she rushed toward the wall safe where we kept the property deeds and family bonds. She punched the combination into the keypad with frantic, jerky movements and waited for the green light that would grant her access to my inheritance. I watched a grim smile touch my lips when the red light flashed repeatedly to deny her access to the documents she so desperately craved. She did not know that I had manually reset the digital code the night before our trip because my intuition had whispered that something was wrong with her behavior. Daphne screamed in frustration and kicked the heavy metal door of the safe before snatching her phone from her pocket to make a call. The high-definition audio picked up her heavy breathing as she waited for the person on the other end to pick up the line. Her voice was a mixture of terror and aggression as she shouted into the receiver, "Give me 2 more days? My sister isn't dead yet, but I'll find a way to get her signature. Don't touch me." My heart turned to ice in my chest as those words confirmed that my death had been part of the negotiation she made with her creditors. I pressed the save button on the screen to secure the recording to a cloud server that only Mr. Finch and I could access. This was the undeniable proof of her financial motive that would link the tampered breaks to her desperate need for cash to pay off her gambling debts. She continued to pace around the office while arguing with the person on the phone, before throwing a porcelain vase against the wall in a fit of rage. A porcelain cup was placed gently on the coffee table as Stella sat down beside me on the plush velvet sofa. She looked from the angry woman destroying my office on the screen to my stoic face, with an expression of deep concern furrowing her brow. She took a deep breath before asking the question that had been plaguing her since I arrived at her doorstep. "How long are you going to let her run wild? Why not call the police and arrest her right now?" I turned off the tablet screen to stop watching the pathetic display of my sister's unraveling life because I had seen enough to know she was cornered. I looked my friend in the eye and shook my head with a cold resolve that I had never possessed before the accident changed me. I replied steadily, "Not yet. I want her to lose everything from her reputation to her freedom, not just an administrative fine." The police could arrest her for attempted fraud based on this video, but she could potentially bail herself out or claim emotional distress to reduce the sentence. I needed her to dig a hole so deep that not even the best lawyers in Milwaukee could pull her out of it. She had tried to kill me for money, so I would ensure she lost every penny she ever hoped to touch before sending her to prison. The game had changed, and the predator who cut my brakes was about to realize she had become the prey. The next morning, the urgent ringing of the doorbell shattered the quiet peace of Stella's suburban apartment. I was sitting at the kitchen island nursing a cup of herbal tea while trying to ignore the persistent throbbing in my temples when the noise made me flinch. My best friend Stella exchanged a worried glance with me before walking over to the entryway to check the peephole on the heavy wooden door. Before she could even unlock the deadbolt, a fist pounded against the wood again, with enough force to rattle the frame pictures hanging on the adjacent wall. Stella barely cracked the door open before my sister Daphne pushed her way inside with the aggressive entitlement of someone who believed she owned the world. I watched her storm into the living room with a mixture of disbelief and dread as I realized my safe haven had been compromised so quickly. She was waving her smartphone in the air like a weapon while shouting about how easy it was to track my location through the shared delivery application we had used for years. It seemed I had made a critical error in forgetting to log out of the family account on my personal device before ordering dinner the previous night. Daphne did not ask how I was feeling or why I had bandages wrapped around my head from the accident she caused. She marched straight toward me with her eyes blazing with fury and pointed a manicured finger directly in my face. Her voice was shrill enough to make my headache spike in intensity as she unleashed her misplaced anger upon me. "You ungrateful brat. I've been running around trying to take care of you, and you're hiding here, making the whole family worry." I stared at the woman I had once looked up to and realized that every word leaving her mouth was a carefully constructed lie designed to manipulate me. The old Violet would have apologized immediately and tried to smooth things over to keep the peace in our fractured family. But the Violet who had been left to die in the snow was gone, replaced by someone cold and calculating. I reached into the manila folder sitting next to my tea mug and pulled out the stack of printed transaction attempts I had downloaded yesterday. I tossed the damning bank statements onto the glass coffee table where they fanned out to reveal the unauthorized transfer requests she had made while I was unconscious. I looked her dead in the eye and kept my voice dangerously calm as I delivered the question that would strip away her facade. Are you worried about me, or are you worried because you can't withdraw the money from our parents' trust fund?" The color drained from Daphne's face as she looked down at the documents that proved she had tried to liquidate our assets before my body was even cold. She opened her mouth to shout again, but the words died in her throat when she realized I knew exactly what she had been doing during those 5 days. The aggression in her posture melted away instantly, to be replaced by a manipulative display of tearful victimhood that I had seen 1,000 times before. She clasped her hands together and claimed that she had only tried to move the funds to secure a high-yield investment opportunity that would secure our financial future forever. She insisted that she was only trying to protect me from the burden of managing such a large estate while I was recovering from my injuries. I watched her performance with disgusted detachment because I knew that investment was just a euphemism for paying off the loan sharks who were breathing down her neck. When I remained silent and refused to pick up the pen, she tried to shove into my hand to sign the authorization papers. Her expression hardened back into cold malice. She leaned over the table and lowered her voice to a menacing whisper while threatening to destroy my life if I did not cooperate. She vowed to go to family court and testify that the accident had caused severe frontal lobe damage, which rendered me mentally incompetent to manage my own affairs. She explained with a cruel smile that once she was appointed my legal guardian by the state, she would have full control over every cent I owned, regardless of what I wanted. The audacity of her threat was the final severance of the bond that had tied us together since childhood. I stood up slowly from the bar stool and walked around the island until I was standing face to face with the monster who shared my DNA. I pointed toward the open door where Stella was already standing with her phone in hand, ready to call the authorities if things escalated further. I did not shout or scream because I wanted her to hear every syllable of my rejection clearly. "Get out of here immediately, Daphne. From now on, I don't have a sister like you anymore." Daphne looked at me with shock because she had never heard me speak with such absolute authority in her entire life. She snatched her purse from the sofa and stormed out the door while muttering curses under her breath about how I would regret crossing her. As the door slammed shut behind her, I felt a heavy weight lift off my shoulders because I knew the real war had just begun. That evening, my phone vibrated incessantly with a barrage of notifications from social media that lit up the dimly lit living room. I picked up the device with a heavy feeling in my chest because I knew instinctively that Daphne had launched her next attack. I unlocked the screen to see a live broadcast notification that was being shared by hundreds of mutual acquaintances and local community groups. I tapped on the link and watched as my sister's tear-streaked face filled the display while she sat in her designer living room. She was putting on the performance of a lifetime by sobbing uncontrollably into a tissue while thousands of viewers offered their sympathy in the real-time comments section. Daphne looked directly into the camera lens with swollen eyes and claimed that the accident had caused severe psychological trauma that left me paranoid and delusional. She spun a convincing narrative about how I was suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, which made me believe my own family was trying to harm me. She lowered her voice to a conspiratorial whisper as she accused bad friends of isolating me from my loving sister to manipulate me into signing over my assets. She painted herself as the martyred guardian who was desperately trying to save her mentally unstable sibling from being exploited by strangers. The comments section was filled with angry messages from people who believed her lies and called me an ungrateful burden who needed to be institutionalized for my own safety. The situation escalated quickly from personal humiliation to professional devastation as my business phone began to ring. I answered the first call from a long-term partner who managed our commercial real estate holdings only to be met with an awkward silence. He cleared his throat nervously before explaining that he had seen the disturbing video circulating online regarding my mental health status. He informed me that the board of directors was uncomfortable moving forward with our upcoming contract renewal due to the potential legal risks associated with my alleged instability. I tried to explain that it was a personal family dispute, but he cut me off by saying they needed to pause all operations until I could provide an official psychiatric evaluation clearing me for duty. I ended the call with a trembling hand as I realized Daphne was not just attacking my character, but actively destroying the career I had built from the ground up. She knew exactly where to strike to hurt me the most, because she knew how much I valued the professional legacy our parents had left behind. Stella paced back and forth across the rug with her fists clenched in fury as she listened to the lies spewing from the tablet on the coffee table. She wanted to log in and scream the truth at every single person in that comment section who dared to judge me without knowing the facts. I reached out to silence the video because listening to her voice was only draining the energy I needed for the fight ahead. I looked up at my friend who was ready to go to war on the internet for me and shook my head slowly. Engaging with Daphne on social media was exactly what she wanted because it would only make me look defensive and erratic. I turned to Stella with a cold calmness that surprised even myself given the chaos erupting around us. She thinks public opinion can save her from debt. She chose the wrong opponent. I knew that winning an argument on the internet would not save my reputation, but proving she tried to kill me would silence her forever. I needed irrefutable physical evidence that proved the accident was a premeditated attempt on my life rather than a mechanical failure. I realized with a sudden jolt of adrenaline that the most important witness in this entire case was the silver sedan lying at the bottom of that ravine. Daphne had been in a rush to leave the hospital, but I needed to know if she had been equally fast in disposing of the wreckage. My personal cell phone rang again, but this time the caller ID displayed the name of Mr. Finch. I answered immediately and listened intently as he delivered the breakthrough news we had been praying for all evening. He had spent the last few hours tracking the tow truck records and discovered that Daphne had not sent the car to an insurance impound lot. She had paid a private hauler in cash to transport the vehicle directly to an unlicensed scrapyard on the industrial side of Milwaukee. Mr. Finch warned me that the yard was scheduled to run their crusher at midnight to clear out the inventory for the week. We did not waste a single second as we grabbed our coats and rushed out into the freezing winter night. Stella drove her car with white-knuckled determination while I navigated us through the desolate streets toward the coordinates Mr. Finch had sent. The scrapyard was a dark maze of twisted metal and rusted machinery that loomed like skeletons under the pale moonlight. We parked the car a block away to avoid alerting the night watchman and met Mr. Finch near a gap in the chain-link fence. The three of us moved silently through the rows of crushed vehicles while scanning the piles for the familiar silver paint of my sedan. The bitter wind bit through my coat as we searched desperately against the ticking clock. Finally, I spotted the mangled remains of my car sitting near the conveyor belt that led to the massive hydraulic crusher. It was only minutes away from being reduced to a cube of scrap metal that would bury the truth forever. I scrambled over the icy ground and fell to my knees beside the front wheel, well where the damage was most accessible. I clicked on my high-powered flashlight and shined the beam directly onto the undercarriage to inspect the brake assembly. My breath caught in my throat as the bright light revealed exactly what I had suspected since waking up in that hospital bed. The brake line had not snapped from wear and tear, nor had it burst from pressure during the drive. The rubber hose had a clean, precise incision that cut halfway through the material, leaving just enough integrity to hold until I applied heavy pressure at that sharp curve. "Mr. Finch, look at this," I whispered, my voice trembling, not from the cold, but from the horror of confirmation. The lawyer leaned in with his own camera to document the cut, before carefully removing the compromised section of the hose as evidence. We had secured the smoking gun just moments before the heavy machinery roared to life to consume the evidence of my sister's crime. Daphne believed she had erased her tracks, but she had just handed me the weapon that would end her freedom. That weekend, the annual fundraising gala for the Milwaukee Business Association took place lavishly at the Grand Hotel, transforming the ballroom into a shimmering sea of silk gowns and tailored tuxedos. The crystal chandeliers cast a golden glow over the city's elite, who gathered to network and flaunt their wealth while sipping expensive champagne. I stood in the shadows of the heavy velvet curtains near the entrance and watched my sister navigate the room with the grace of a seasoned predator. Daphne looked breathtakingly beautiful in a crimson evening gown that I knew she had purchased on credit just hours before the event. She moved confidently between groups of wealthy investors and whispered tragic lies into their ears while dabbing at her dry eyes with a lace handkerchief. From my vantage point, I could see her cornering Mr. Henderson, a prominent banker who had managed our family accounts for decades before his retirement. She placed a hand on his arm and leaned in close to spin her narrative about being the sole guardian of her mentally unstable sister. I knew she was using my alleged incapacity to solicit emergency bridge loans under the pretense of securing the best medical care for me. It was a brilliant strategy because it allowed her to beg for money without looking desperate, framing her financial need as an act of sacrificial love for a sick sibling. She was moments away from closing a deal that would give her enough cash to flee the country, but she had no idea that her time had already run out. I nodded to Mr. Finch, who stood stoically beside me in his charcoal suit, and we stepped out from the shadows to make our entrance. The heavy bandage wrapped around my head stood in stark contrast to the elegance of the room, drawing immediate attention from the guests nearest the door. A hush rippled through the ballroom like a wave as people turned to stare at the woman who was supposedly locked away in a psychiatric facility. I walked with my head held high, despite the throbbing pain in my temples refusing to look like the victim Daphne had painted me to be. Daphne turned around when she noticed the sudden silence falling over the crowd and the champagne glass slip from her fingers to shatter on the marble floor. Her face went pale as she stared at me, her eyes darting frantically around the room as if searching for an escape route that did not exist. For a moment, she looked like a trapped animal, but then her survival instinct kicked in, and she decided to double down on her lie. She rushed toward me with her arms outstretched, as if to restrain me, pitching her voice high enough to carry to the back of the room. She pointed a trembling finger at me and screamed at the uniformed men standing near the perimeter. "Security, get this crazy girl out of here. She's agitated." Two large security guards hesitated, looking between the hysterical woman in the red dress and the calm woman with the bandaged head. Daphne continued to screech about how I was having a psychotic break and needed to be sedated immediately for the safety of the guests. The crowd murmured uneasily, unsure of who to believe, as the guards began to move tentatively in my direction to escort me out. My heart hammered against my ribs, but I stood my ground because I knew I was not fighting this battle alone tonight. Before the guards could lay a hand on me, a deep and authoritative voice boomed through the microphone system, freezing everyone in place. "Mr. Caldwell, my father's oldest business partner and the most respected figure in Milwaukee's financial district, stepped out from behind the podium on the main stage." He raised a hand to halt the security team, his expression thunderous as he glared down at my sister. The room fell into a deathly silence as the man who had built half the city commanded the attention of every soul present. Mr. Caldwell looked directly at my sister, his voice dripping with disappointment and authority, as he delivered the verdict that would end her charade. "The only person acting here is you, Daphne. I confirm Violet is completely sane, and the sole heir." A collective gasp swept through the room as the weight of his words settled over the crowd, shattering the fragile credibility Daphne had built. The investors she had been courting took a synchronized step back from her, looking at her with expressions of disgust and betrayal. Mr. Caldwell continued to speak, informing the room that he had personally reviewed the medical and legal documents proving my competency and her deceit. He announced that any financial dealings with Daphne would be considered invalid, as she had no legal authority over the family estate. Daphne stood alone in the center of the ballroom, stripped of her lies and exposed as the fraud she truly was. The woman who had walked in like a queen was now a pariah, shrinking under the judgmental gaze of the society she so desperately wanted to impress. She looked at me one last time with eyes full of venomous hatred, but I simply turned my back on her to shake Mr. Caldwell's hand. Her reign of terror was over, and as she fled the room amidst whispers of scandal, I finally felt the heavy chains of her manipulation fall away. 2 days after the party, the desperation of being cornered caused Daphne to lose all reason and abandon her sense of self-preservation. The dangerous men she had borrowed money from were no longer accepting her excuses because her public humiliation at the gala had proven she was penniless. She knew that her only remaining option to avoid physical harm was to steal the official company seal from my private office to forge a check against the business account. I had anticipated this exact move because I knew a drowning person would grab at anything to keep their head above water regardless of the consequences. I instructed Mr. Finch to disable the silent alarm system at the office to create an inviting opening for her to enter without resistance. However, I ensured that every high-definition security camera was recording and that a team of officers was waiting silently in the adjacent conference room. I stood in the darkness of the hallway with my heart pounding against my ribs while watching her shadow move across the frosted glass of my office door. It was a surreal nightmare to watch my own sister break into the sanctuary, where our father had taught us how to run an honest business. She moved with the frantic energy of a cornered animal as she ransacked my desk drawers in search of the heavy brass stamp that authorized financial transactions. I could hear her muttering curses under her breath as she threw important files and family photographs onto the floor in her manic search. The sight of her destroying our family legacy for quick cash extinguished the last flickering ember of guilt I had felt about setting this trap. The moment her fingers closed around the wooden handle of the seal was the moment she sealed her fate legally and irrevocably. I signaled the lead detective with a subtle nod, and he flipped the master switch to flood the room with blinding fluorescent light. Daphne screamed in terror and dropped the seal onto the hardwood floor as uniformed officers swarmed into the room with their weapons drawn to surround her. She looked around wildly for an escape route that did not exist before her eyes landed on me, standing calmly behind the police line. She stood frozen near the desk with her hands raised in surrender, while her chest heaved with panic and confusion. The shock on her face quickly twisted into a mask of pure hatred as she realized she had walked straight into a carefully laid trap designed to catch her in the act. The officers grabbed her arms to restrain her, and she began to struggle violently against their grip while screaming at the top of her lungs. Her voice echoed off the walls of the empty office building as she tried to play the victim card one last time in a room full of witnesses. "Violet, you set me up. I'm your sister. You can't do this to me." I walked forward until I was just out of her reach and looked at the woman who had shared my childhood with a mixture of pity and finality. I did not raise my voice because the truth did not need to be shouted to be devastatingly effective against her lies. I looked her dead in the eye and delivered the sentence that severed our bond forever. A sister wouldn't cut her own siblings' brake lines. You chose this ending for yourself. The color drained from her face completely as the meaning of my words sank in, and she realized I knew about the sabotage. The lead detective stepped forward to read the full list of charges against her while holding the warrant we had secured earlier that day. He informed her in a monotone voice that she was under arrest for burglary and fraud, but he did not stop there. He continued to read the additional charges of attempted bodily harm and malicious destruction of property based on the forensic evidence from the brake hose. Daphne stopped struggling and went limp in the officer's arms as the reality of spending decades behind bars finally crashed down on her. I watched them drag her out into the night and felt a profound sense of relief that the monster was finally in a cage. 6 months later, the trial of Daphne's case became the center of attention for the entire state of Wisconsin as the media descended upon the courthouse to witness the fall of a socialite. The courtroom was packed to capacity with curious onlookers and former business associates who whispered among themselves while awaiting the final verdict from the jury. I sat in the front row beside Mr. Finch and Mr. Caldwell, keeping my hands clasped tightly together in my lap to stop them from trembling with anticipation. Daphne sat at the defense table looking pale and gaunt, stripping away the glamorous facade she had worn like armor for her entire life to reveal the frightened criminal underneath. The judge's voice boomed through the silent room as he read the jury's decision to convict her on all counts, including attempted murder, grand larceny, and burglary. He sentenced her to 10 years in a maximum security state prison without the possibility of parole for the first 7 years due to the premeditated nature of her crimes. Daphne let out a strangled sob as the bailiffs moved in to handcuff her, finally realizing that her tears could no longer manipulate the people around her. As they led her away to begin her decade of incarceration, she looked back at me one last time, but I felt nothing but a hollow sense of closure knowing the threat was finally gone. Following the conclusion of the trial, I made the difficult decision to sell the sprawling Victorian mansion where we had grown up, because the walls held too many memories of betrayal. I could no longer walk through the hallways without remembering the day Daphne tried to steal the deed, or the nights she spent plotting my demise in the kitchen. I sold the property to a young family who would fill it with new laughter and moved myself into a modern apartment overlooking the serene waters of Lake Michigan. The minimalist space was filled with natural light and lacked the heavy shadows of the past, marking the beginning of a peaceful chapter where I no longer had to sleep with one eye open. I took the remaining money from the family trust which Daphne had tried so desperately to steal and used it to establish a permanent scholarship fund in our parents' names. It was the best way to honor their legacy of generosity while ensuring that the wealth they worked so hard for was used to build futures rather than destroy them. Mr. Caldwell helped me organize the board of directors, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was making my father proud by using his resources to help underprivileged students achieve their dreams. One rainy afternoon, a plain white envelope arrived in my mailbox bearing the distinct stamp of the state correctional facility and my sister's handwriting. I stood in front of the gas fireplace in my living room for a long time, staring at her looping script while debating whether or not to open it. Part of me wanted to know if she was finally sorry, or if she was simply writing to blame me for her circumstances once again. However, I realized that reading her words would only invite her toxic energy back into the sanctuary I had worked so hard to build. I tossed the sealed envelope into the dancing flames and watched the paper curl and blacken until it turned to ash, symbolizing the final severance of the bond that had almost killed me. The next morning, I drove to the cemetery with a bouquet of white lilies to visit the graves of our parents under the clear spring sky. The air was crisp and smelled of melting snow, signaling the end of the long, dark winter that had consumed my life for so long. I placed the flowers against the cold granite headstone and stood there for a long time in comfortable silence, feeling a profound sense of lightness in my chest. I had protected their name, saved their legacy, and survived the unimaginable betrayal of their other daughter. I whispered a final promise to live a happy life for all of us, turned my back on the shadows of the past, and walked toward the warmth of the sun. The tragic downfall of Daphne and the resilience of Violet serve as a powerful reminder that money has the terrifying ability to reveal a person's true character. We often believe that family bonds are unbreakable, but when greed enters the equation, even the closest blood relatives can become unrecognizable enemies. Violet's journey teaches us that holding on to a toxic relationship simply because of shared DNA is a dangerous mistake that can cost you your peace and even your life. True strength is not found in forgiveness when the other party is unrepentant, but in the decisiveness to cut ties and protect your own future. There is no shame in walking away from family members who view you as a resource rather than a person. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is to close the door firmly on the past and refuse to let anyone, no matter who they are, steal your dignity or your destiny. Thank you so much for following Violet's intense journey to justice with us until the very end. We hope this story inspired you to stand up for yourself against toxic relationships. Here is a question for you. If you were in Violet's shoes, would you have opened that final letter from prison, or would you have burned it just like she did? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more compelling stories.